Virtually every faction in Star Wars had a sizable list of war crimes to answer for. From the Republic to the Empire of the Sith, every side, good or evil, did some pretty unsavory stuff. But by far, the ones with the most war crimes to answer for were the Mandalorians. Yes, even when you compare them to the Sith Empires, the Mandalorians lived for war, and apparently war crimes were included in that. In this video, we're going to be taking a look at the most heinous war crimes committed by the Mando Adder, and why they seemingly enjoyed committing them so much.
Attention, Sergeant on deck!
From the day of their formation in about 7000 BBY, the Mandalorians were an incredibly warlike people. At that time, the Mandalorians were all Tongs, members of a grey-skinned reptilian species distantly related to humanity. They worshipped a god called Cad Haringir, the Destroyer God, who they credited as the bringer of change, vigor, and growth. Cad Haringir, they believed, was locked in an endless battle with Arisum, the god of sloth and stagnation, and their way of paying homage to him was to wage war themselves, resisting the trap of idleness and peace. Under the leadership of Mandalore I, they began the Mandalorian Crusades, an endless series of holy wars that lasted nearly 3,000 years before they became a theatre of the Great Sith War. The Crusades were where the war crimes of the Mandalorians began. Species that found themselves targets of the Mandalorians were often driven to extinction by the Crusaders, who saw genocide as just another part of war. We don't even know the names of most of these species, as the Mandalorians were so devastatingly thorough in annihilating them. One of the few we do know of were the Fennelar, an isolationist species that, at the time, was known for its powerful warships. The Mandalorians conquered Fennel, their homeworld, and wiped out the Fennelar, claiming their technology for their own. But perhaps the worst war crime of the Mandalorian Crusades, and one of the worst war crimes in Mandalorian history, was what the Mandalorians did to Basilisk. Basilisk was a core world located in the very heart of Republic space, yet the Mandalorians attacked it anyway, seeking to capture the Basiliskans' formidable war droids. The Basiliskans, a dragon-like reptilian species, fiercely resisted and called in the Republic to help, but not even Republic reinforcements could stop the advance of the Crusaders. As they faced defeat, the Basiliskans poisoned their homeworld in defiance, leaving it a dead shell of its former self. In retaliation, after laying claim to the Basilisk war droids, the Mandalorians didn't just kill the Basiliskans as they likely originally planned, instead they took them as slaves. The Basiliskans were worked like beasts and routinely tortured. The Mandalorians treated those surviving Basiliskans so terribly that the entire species devolved into an animal state, which, millennia later, the Mandalorians would routinely use as mounts, just as they had used the Basilisk war droids before them. The Basiliskans became known as Lagato's war dragons, and as far as we know, the species never regained sentience. This implies a level of terrible treatment we couldn't even begin to fathom. Around the end of the Mandalorian Crusades, Mandalorian culture began to evolve. Starting with Mandalore the Indomitable, they stopped worshipping Cad Haringir in favour of worshipping war as a concept. Following their defeat in the Great Sith War, they underwent even more dramatic changes. Under Mandalore the Ultimate, the Mandalorians began accepting members of all species into their ranks and became a much more organised and effective military force. They became the Mandalorian Neo-Crusaders, which would turn Mandalorian space into an empire in the Mandalorian Wars. On the surface, you might think this transformation would make the Mandalorians a bit less barbaric, but you'd be dead wrong. The Neo-Crusaders were actually responsible for the worst atrocities of all. Their new policy of accepting members of all species as long as they were honourable fighters and lived by the warrior code did save many conquered worlds from destruction, but this didn't mean the Mandalorians gave up on genocide. Far from it. If a population fought with what the Mandalorians deemed cowardly or dishonourable tactics, or if they surrendered without a fight, the Mandalorians believed genocide was what they deserved. It didn't take much for the Mandalorians to see enemy tactics as dishonourable either. In the Battle of Sirocco, upon being informed that the Republic had set up its camps close to the planet's cities, Mandalore the Ultimate had the following to say: "I see what they're doing. I see a defense without honor. Let them see what such a defense deserves. Let them burn." Sirocco was then subjected to nuclear bombardment, which glassed nearly the entire planet. This was a deliberately cruel move that expressly targeted the civilians the Republic had been using as shields. Mandalorian turbolasers were more powerful than thermonuclear missiles, but the Mandalorians opted to use nukes just to douse the planet in radioactive fallout. Many of the Neo-Crusaders' worst war crimes were the work of Cassius Fett, one of Mandalore the Ultimate's most trusted advisors and one of the first human Mandalorians. The most infamous example of his brutality was the Battle of Cathar. There, the Mandalorians attacked Cathar at night, while most of its people were asleep, allowing them to crush the native Cathar in a rather one-sided fight. The Cathar were no cowards, but an incredibly tough species, and in other circumstances, the Mandalorians would probably have tried to recruit them. But the attack on Cathar was no ordinary raid. It was revenge for the role that Cathar played in their defeat in the Great Sith War. On Cassius Fett's orders, the Mandalorians wiped out the entire planet, nearly driving the Cathar to extinction. When one Mandalorian voiced concerns about slaughtering innocents, Fett ordered her killed alongside the planet's natives. Her mask was later claimed by Revan, who swore he wouldn't remove it until the Mandalorians were defeated. Another world that fed bitterly at the hands of the Neo-Crusaders was Duro, the surface of which was turned into a wasteland during the Mandalorian triumph. Ecological devastation was something the Mandalorians specialized in. On worlds where there wasn't space for a traditional battle, the Mandalorians would casually glass a continent or two before starting the invasion proper, just so they could have solid ground to fight on. Neo-Crusader war crimes weren't limited to genocide either. As we discussed in a video we put out earlier this year, the Mandalorians were quite fond of torture and they had a number of barbaric techniques they enjoyed using. These techniques ranged from immolation to burying victims alive. Some Mandalorian torturers were so brutal that even fellow Mandalorians thought they had a few screws loose, the most notable of whom was Demagol. Demagol was an absolutely sadistic scientist who specialized in studying the Jedi, and by studying, we mean cutting them open while they were still alive and awake. Demagol was obsessed with finding out how the Force worked and how the Mandalorians could co-opt it, and he went through quite a few Jedi in his quest to do so. Mandalorian's weapons technology is also worth a quick mention here. As you should probably expect, the Mandalorians were quite good at making weapons. As a matter of fact, they actually invented modern blaster technology shortly before the Mandalorian Wars. But blasters were the tamest part of their arsenal, even if Mandalorian blasters were, as a rule, oversized and overpowered. Consider for example the Mandalorian Ripper, a sort of cross between a slug thrower and a disruptor. With the Mandalorian Ripper, Mando weaponsmiths took slug thrower technology, which is to say real-world firearms tech, and crossed it with disruptor technology, an extremely powerful variant of blaster tech that pierced shields and disintegrated targets. The result was absolutely devastating. The weapon wrapped bullets in a cocoon of disruptor strength energy, which allowed the bullets to punch through pretty much anything. The weapon was called the Mandalorian Ripper because of the effect its rounds had on organic targets, ripping them to shreds. The rifle Din Djarin uses in The Mandalorian, for the record, appears to be a somewhat refined version of this weapon, which functions solely as a disruptor while retaining the slugs used by the older weapon. Needless to say, the Mandalorian Ripper was banned in the Republic. Now that we've painted a solid picture of Mandalorian war crimes and brutality, we've got a question to answer. Why? Well, simply put, Mandalorians simply didn't see war crimes in the same way everyone else did. As we mentioned earlier, they believed life was a struggle between the binary influences of conflict and sloth, and that only through conflict would they avoid stagnation and weakness. Their lives were dedicated to the battle against sloth in all forms, especially in wartime. The innocents they slaughtered weren't innocents to them, but servants of the enemy, the god of sloth. How the Mandalorians interpreted this philosophy changed greatly over the years, but they stuck to one common theme. The weak were actively fighting on the side of the sloth. Those who surrendered or didn't put up a good fight, in Mandalorian eyes, were a glimpse of what they were fighting to stop themselves from becoming. They hated those glimpses, and so they hated those who surrendered. In fact, they hated them far more than they hated those few who had defeated them. Even Revan, who had nearly destroyed the Mandalorians outright, was respected greatly by the warrior clans. They had no such respect for the cowards who refused to fight them. So that's why the Mandalorians committed so many terrible war crimes. But what do you think? Would you like to hear more about these periods in Mandalorian history? Let us know in the comment section below. And just before you jet off guys, if you want to hear the music we use in this video unobstructed, make sure you check out our Relax Jack music channel. There's a ton of bangers there. And if you want access to some cool rewards, updated perks on our Patreon, make sure you check that one out too. And if you just want to join our wider Geetsly's community, make sure to join us on our Discord and Geetsly's gaming network. All these links are in the description below. Anyways guys, as always, thank you so much for watching and I hope to see you in the next video.